Okay, my name is Stephanie Stern and from University of Arizona. And I just want to thank everyone for having me and for coming to the talk. Today, I want to talk about means testing federally funded buyouts for underwater homes, right? And I'm going to focus on flooding, which, to date has been sort of the majority of managed retreat. But I think some of the points I'm going to make have applications as well to wildfire and drought and other climate adaptation scenarios. One of the reasons I was particularly drawn to flooding is that there is such a sharp income bifurcation on floodplains with often very wealthy people and much lower income people that I think presents some particular policy challenges. So when I'm talking about managed retreat today, I'm going to focus on the alternative of buyouts of government funded property acquisition. But of course, there's a lot of other alternatives, right? Relocation funding, partial buyouts, preferential ranking for affordable rental housing and homeownership programs, and a whole host of incentives that I don't think we've really delved into. Now, as most of you are probably aware, federal buyouts typically acquire flood-prone properties at pre-flood fair market value. Another hallmark is that it's voluntary. The goal is to relocate people out of harm's way. And typically the land is then dedicated or permanently conserved as open space or flood buffer zones, right? Most of the funding for this is historical, coming from disaster statutes and funding mechanisms. Now, I'm not going to discuss this in any detail, but there's a whole sort of tangle of buyout statutes. It's been gratifying to hear from our government representatives that there's more effort to centralize and sort of unify these programs. But we have multiple programs that fund buyouts under FEMA and then others under HUD. Now, what I became interested in and have written about and researched is, should there be means testing for federally funded managed retreat? Right? And I think compared to when I first started working on this, I think there's starting to be more movement and discussion. The recent resilience statute, I think, is a way to really try to quantify who's most at risk. But currently, we don't have any statutory or regulatory requirements for means testing, right? And by means testing, I mean allocating funding or allowing funding based on wealth or income. Now, there's a few key arguments, I think, in favor of means testing retreat. And the first one is scale, right? Our present scale of buyouts has been around 50,000. But all of the projections for the future indicate that is going to increase manyfold, right? With some projections suggesting that by the end of the century, it'll be over 13 million. Oh, sorry, this is skipping ahead a bit. So it does seem that there's this kind of elephant in the room of how are we going to fund full flood market value property acquisitions at scale in the future, right? And in my mind, that problem has become even more salient in the past few years, where we've had dramatically, skyrocketing real estate prices and people just pouring into the highest risk climate zones, right? And so I think if we don't target or means test our buyouts, they're simply going to be missing capital. The other, slide is showing up this way, but the other argument is just a risk segmentation point, right? And, as we're thinking about buyouts, particularly if we're viewing them as kind of a harm reduction, program rather than a property compensation program, which I would argue in favor of. We don't really have a lot of risk segmentation going on in our selection. And I'm just going to highlight a few factors, but vulnerability factors include socioeconomics, which of course intersects with race, access to a car, right, which often but not always follows from socioeconomics, pet ownership, age and disability, right? And again, currently we don't target to those factors. I also think it's important to consider capacity to insure against loss, right? And if we're thinking about targeting or shifting more funds to lower income individuals, I think it's important to bear in mind that they have more financial limitations in insuring against loss, right? Now we do have subsidized flood insurance, but those premiums are rising. Not everyone in a floodplain uses that. And then of course, for tenants, they have access to a different flood insurance program, which provides very limited coverage for personal possessions, right? So again, I think this is another argument in favor of targeting towards low income groups. The third sort of rationale I wanted to consider are incentives for climate risk taking, right? And this is something I've written about, but should we have on our radar the idea that as we sort of layer buyouts on top of already subsidized flood insurance, are we creating another incremental incentive to develop and invest in high risk areas, right? Perhaps we're not at our current scale of 50,000 to date, but will we be as this, as buyouts grow, right? And of course, that's going to, affect everyone, not only the people that receive buyouts, but others, developers. And there is, a risk, I think, that we haven't fully grappled with in managed retreat, that by buying out properties, we could increase total losses in dispossessions if our buyouts in any way encourage or make people feel more safe about moving to some of the riskiest areas. Some of my work has borrowed a little bit from a legal academic theory, transition relief theory. And that theory was looking at changes in legal rules and when should you compensate people. And the concern was that compensation can distort incentives and encourage overinvestment and reduce investors' motivation to sort of anticipate changes here in law, but in my application in climate. Right. And so I think these are points to consider within managed retreat. Now, I do think this incentive problem is much less for low income owners and tenants. And the sad reason for that is that there's less choice. Right. And so many, not all, but many low income owners and tenants in very high risk floodplains are there because there aren't other options for affordable housing, right? And so I don't think buyouts are going to have that same incentive effect as with middle and upper income owners. And I think those individuals and households are, really poised to bear very highly concentrated losses from flooding. Right. So in my mind, there is the strongest rationale for subsidizing or segmenting this group. So what I want to propose is that we move towards limiting, right? Perhaps incrementally, right? Because that's going to be a politically, difficult, but limiting buyouts for middle and upper income residents, right? And trying to sort of nudge those households into the private insurance market. All right. So my position would be a presumption against buyout compensation for middle and upper income households, right? Though I would certainly, as I thought it through, admit some exceptions, right? Very long time owners that perhaps bought prior to, any awareness of climate change, people in, life or death, imminent peril situations. I think we could allow for some carve outs while still making our bio programs primarily intended to benefit low income owners and low income tenants. Now, before turning to how to implement it, I did want to mention that, you know, I think this proposal is controversial, and a lot of low income communities are legitimately worried that they're being targeted for buyout. And so I think it's important to really underscore that buyout has to remain, you know, voluntary. And this would just be giving low income owners and tenants the option, right? And ideally kind of coalescing with the recent federal movement towards community driven relocation. Now, in terms of how to implement it, I mean, a good deal of implementation could happen at the federal level. But from a legal perspective, because of sort of the cooperative federalism setup of these buyouts, I think states and localities can also implement some income prioritization or means testing using the federal funds, right? There's no federal prohibition on that. So even if the federal government doesn't act, I think there's opportunities for states and localities too, right? And just as a final note, the other area that I would, you know, really like to see more movement on, in keeping with this idea of means testing and income targeting, is tenant buyouts, right? You know, currently tenants receive relocation assistance. There's sort of varying reports on whether or not that's adequate. So could that be enhanced? And should we be considering compensation for the tenancy, or what lawyers call the leasehold interest in buyouts of tenants? So, stuck here. That is all. Thank you everyone for your time, and look forward to your questions at the end of all the talks.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jowers. I am a program director for a program on environmental justice that's a joint program of the Keenan Institute for Ethics and the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability at Duke University, and am presenting some work today that I've been doing with co-authors Lala, who is at the University of Kentucky, and Christopher Timmins, who was at Duke at the time that we did this research, but is now moving over to the University of Wisconsin School of Business. So really excited to be here today, and going to go through this background, hopefully really quickly. This will start. There we go. You've heard a lot about buyouts today. So just briefly on our motivation, we have increasing flood risk. We expect with rising temperatures and sea level rise that we're going to see increased frequency of extreme events and increased losses, and particularly in communities of color. Again, many of you have been hearing about buyouts today. So in the interest of showing you results, I'll go over this very quickly, but strategies to adapt to all this increasing risk include, putting in infrastructure and insurance, also assistance, and then the managed retreat or the buyouts. And the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program is the primary source of the federal funding for property buyouts that we are focusing on in research. So we wanted to investigate the equity implications of buyouts and really figure out how households are being compensated. Are we reaching fair market value? How does race and ethnicity interact with those dynamics? And so we know this isn't the first research to really look at the racial dynamics of federal buyouts and find some discriminatory impacts. But the difference here is we're using a national data set, administrative data that is on all of the housing transactions in the United States over time, and combining it with household data from InfoUSA to look at how these impacts differ by race. We've seen this map several times today, but this is the geographic distribution of FEMA buyouts, the existing FEMA buyouts. So we are using the FEMA buyouts from a FOIA request released to the National Public Radio, and have about 41,000 buyouts. And that information gives us the address, the fiscal year, the name, the price paid, and the occupancy type, and some information about the house structure. So then we take that and combine it with an administrative data set of all of the housing transactions in the United States that a company called CoreLogic provides. So it gives us property attributes like address, age, has it been through a major renovation, square footage, number of bedrooms, many of the things that you can imagine would affect the market value in a housing market. So we combine that, we match them to see if we can find and identify the transaction in CoreLogic that corresponds to each of the FEMA buyouts so that we can recover that actual price, the date of sale, and some owner information. We also match it to a data set from Info USA that gives us information about residential historical files. Now, this is identifying households, so we can track people's movement through time, where they are going for as they move. And we have measures that tell us the likelihood that someone is a renter versus a buyer or an owner, and gives us an imputed race and ethnicity, information about family structure. It has, an indicator for children, and an estimate for income and wealth, which is relevant to this research. So we have these unique family IDs that allow us to track them and match them with the CoreLogic data. Info USA gives us this Wealth Finder score. So, and tells us the individual's net worth, and it's recorded in thousands. And the range of estimated wealth after removing renters, since we're focusing on owner transactions, is 293,000 to 6.5 million. We then combine this with American Community Survey data so that we can track where households are that households that experience buyouts, neighborhoods they move to, and see how the neighborhood characteristics are affected. So when we do this matching, you can see we start with the broader set of buyouts, and then we match them to CoreLogic, and then we match them to sales information. Once we start cutting, if there's missing data, most of this data is collected by CoreLogic from different deeds and registry of deeds at the county level. And so sometimes information might not be recorded, so we have to drop those. So when we get down to what we have matched in our sample, we have about 5,000, and then 2,000 for some of our robustness checks. I'm not going to talk about this very much, but first we start with the non-buyout sales in the areas so that we can recover what the fair market value should be in that area. So we predict the price for buyout properties that based on sales pre the flood event. And next we estimate, sorry, this mouse is giving me fits. All right. So we look at the price discrepancy, and we're using the race characteristics in the census. So we have here white, Black, and Hispanic, and you can see that there's a price differential by race. This is giving us the baseline price. This is where we take that fair market value that we've estimated, and then take the value that was given in the buyout to see what the difference is for the price by race. And you can see that Black and Hispanic receive 10 to 8% less than white households. And that's controlling for all those factors that we that affect the housing market in a particular area. These are robustness checks when thank you, check and make sure that we have a government buyer. We take that sample, and so we still see this effect for Black families. It's 9% less and 5% less for Hispanic. We look then further at where the seller's last name is recorded in the buyout matches the housing data, and see robustness there. So we have 7% and 5%. And then estimates in the third column are the price discrepancies when we include the race of the home buyer in our modeling. So our preference of specification is the final column. And our specification there is we were wondering whether correlates of race are the drivers. And so we control for poverty and linguistic isolation to see if we see an impact there. And we find that the differential for Hispanic disappears there, but the discount for Black owners remains. We next look at wealth, and not going to focus on this too much because I want to get through the results and show you. I'll show you the figures here. We see that after the buyout, Black families' wealth is significantly affected. So this is years since the buyout. We go out 5 years to look at how the wealth in the family is affected. And you see here for Black, its wealth is going down by 4% and 5% respectively. I'm going to show you the neighborhood change because I think I'm running low on time. We also tracked the panel of families in the buyout program to assess the neighborhoods that they moved to see what are the effects on social mobility. So this is neighborhood change for white. We look at a number of factors, looking at the poverty in the neighborhood. This is the data from the American Community Survey. How many households are single parent households? How many households have less than high school education, no English, the skilled labor, and whether they are owners of properties. And you can see for most of the white households, the impact sometimes improves their situation. For Hispanic families, the relative impact to the discount is more damaging than white. And then for Black, we see that there is a significant difference in the neighborhoods that they move to. So poverty increases, the percentage of households with single parents increases, the number of skilled laborers decrease, and ownership decreases in the neighborhoods where they live. So our conclusions are buyout compensation is systematically lower for minorities relative to white property owners when we compare pre-disaster fair market value of their homes. And we think these results are particularly robust for Black families, even when we control for correlates of race, wealth, linguistic isolation, and education. And buyout discounts decrease wealth for all the families that participate but are more damaging, particularly for Black and Hispanic in terms of wealth and the quality of the neighborhoods to which they relocate. Our next steps are, and I should have said this at the beginning, our administrative data stops in the second quarter of 2016. So we're in the process of getting that updated data so that we'll have even more observations and rerun these analysis and see what we see in the more recent years of buyouts. We should be able to add 5 more years to the analysis. And thank you so much for your time. I hope we have a good conversation later.
Hello, everyone. My name is Waqas Raza, and I am a PhD student at the School of Urban Planning, McGill University. So yesterday and today, we were listening about the buyouts that are happening in United States. So, and mostly those are the voluntary. So I'll be taking you towards the other side of the border where there were the forced relocation. So I will be focusing on our buyouts effective policy instrument for reducing flood risk and the vulnerability. So mostly when we talk about the buyouts, so it seems that from its definition that we are focusing on reducing the exposure. So we are not considering the vulnerabilities of the households. So this research is based on Quebec province and in a municipality in Quebec. So I will be talking about, and these are so I will be talking about flood risk in Quebec and what was the government response to that risk. The problems that we identified during our survey in a Quebec buyouts, and the goal and the objectives of this research, a case study, and then methods and analysis. So many areas in Canada, they remains flooded due to the precipitation and snow melt. So in Quebec, it's also like every winter in April, at the end of the winter, they face severe flooding, and some of the municipalities fear every year or every other year the severe flooding. So in Quebec, like 20% of the population is exposed to flooding, and this exclude the co-ownership buildings and rental units. So the major floods in Quebec were 2017 and 19. In 2017, the flood affected hundreds of municipalities. There was the evacuation of thousands of households, and it damaged a lot of properties. And it was also the flooding was also linked to the landslides. And due to this severe, like consecutive floods in 17 and 19, the provincial government in Quebec and then the municipal government was criticized by the households that why they were issuing permits to develop in a flood-prone area from years and years ago. So in response to that flood risk, the government of Quebec, they came up with a policy tool called special planning zone. So what was that? It was like it put a moratorium on the development and redevelopment of houses, a construction in 0 to 20-year flood plan. And then you are allowed to build in 20 to 100 years of flood plan. And the photo that you see on the right, the left side, the blue is the special planning zone. So the construction was banned in these areas, and it's still banned. So it's like the special planning zone. They just come up with a new policy called transitional regime that is effective from 2022, and still the government is looking into another cartography policy. The ZIA, we also call this special planning zone the ZIS policy. It was based on flood exposure, not the risk. And then the upcoming permanent regime will propose a cartography based on risk rather than just exposure. So the government is still exploring into this policy. So under this policy, if your house is in 0 to 20 years of flood plan, and if it's damaged 50%, then you cannot reconstruct, redevelop your house. You must have to relocate somewhere else. And so that this criteria used to assess the eligibility of the buyout was based on the damage threshold, like 50% or more. And then it was based on the location if it's in 0 to 20-year flood zone. And the compensation, maximum compensation was $200,000 for your home plus $50,000 for the land. So this buyout program was met there was a strong reactions from the residents because their properties are worth more than what the government was offering them, like $250,000. And there are some municipalities where like one house is around $1 million in some municipality, but there are also some municipalities where the value of the property is like $200,000 or $300,000. And then the government also put the lifetime financial, the ceiling on the financial assistance. It was like maximum you can, if you rebuild the maximum, you can get $100,000 lifetime. So it was also like to encourage the household to relocate to somewhere else. So after this, the government implement this policy. Some of my colleagues, we are also working on other projects. So what he did, like we interviewed some relocated households to see how effective was this buyout policy. And we found that buyouts may not contribute to a long-term resilience, like the buyouts, the way in which they are implemented in Quebec, they may not contribute. One other thing was that they were focusing only on the exposure. They were excluding the vulnerabilities They were not focusing on other criteria. So in our interviews and survey, we find that most of the households that were living in the flood prone areas, they were poor, like they were low income, and they were senior people like 65 plus year of age, and then they were living alone. So it was very difficult for them. And some people also, like they did a self-retreat to mitigate the risk, because it was like consecutive flooding, and like in some municipalities like in Rigo, even still this year 2023 there was a flooding, but that was not much severe, as you can see in the picture here. And you can see the location of the demolished lot. So it's not like a whole community relocation. It's like it result in a fragmented neighborhood. In Rigo, there were, I think, around 100 houses were demolished. And we also interviewed during our interview with the relocated households, we found the shift in the vulnerabilities. So instead of in our journey of reducing the exposure to flood risk, we have shifted the vulnerabilities of households. So it was from exposure to socioeconomic and health vulnerabilities, those who relocated. So and then also there were challenges for the municipal government to implement this policy, and because there was a lot of confusion with the information. This policy was implemented by the provincial government, so the municipal government responsibility was to implement this, but the policy was prepared and announced by the provincial government. And also these buyouts, they have a lack of risk information. They don't provide relocation guidance, like where should the people go, and they don't track or they don't monitor where people have relocated. This study will be focusing on identify a tool that reduce the risk, not only the flood risk, but also consider the vulnerabilities of the household and enhance the ability of municipal authorities to carry out stewardship roles. And then in this research, we are trying to examine the performance of obligatory buyouts over the rebuilding practices. One thing to mention here that if your house is under this policy, if your house is demolished, let's say 59% or less, then you can rebuild there, but still you are in the flood prone area and you can rebuild up to some certain extent. You cannot renovate or you cannot extend your construction still in that area if you are living in 0 to 20-year flood plan. So we are comparing like how buyout participants have been fared compared to those who are still there in a flood-prone area. They cannot renovate, they cannot extend their construction. So the research questions to look for are how have obligatory buyout policies impacted the vulnerabilities and resiliency of relocated households? To what extent and what forms of vulnerabilities are targeted, ignored, reduced, or deepened through obligatory buyouts? Where did people go? Even the government, they don't know like where people go. So they don't track. So, but sometimes they have like the email address or the contact information. So we got that, and through this way we are tracking those people to ask them for an interview or survey. And how have buyout household fared compared to those who remained and rebuilt? To what extent have obligatory buyout reduced the flood risk and enhanced the resilience of relocated households? And then to come up with a policy that is effective, equitable, and long-lasting, that can reduce the risk and the vulnerabilities of relocated and flood-affected households. So the case study area that we are focusing on is Rigo. There are several factors why we selected Rigo. Rigo was the municipality near Montreal that was most severely affected by the flood, and there was flood in 17-19, and this year in 2023 they also faced flooding. So, but that was not much severe. So maybe the government need to look into the policies or adaptation tools to consider. They will have to do some relocation in near future. So because like in Rigo, most of the area, there was like almost 90 houses demolished during 2017 and 19, and most of the like 50% of the houses that were demolished, they are constructed on the partially or fully constructed on the wetlands, and they were in 0 to 2 year flood plan. So the criteria that was the scope of the buyout was reactive. It was like after the flooding, the government announced the buyout program. There was a cap compensation. You cannot get more than 250. So all the participants, they got $250,000. Recently, under transitional regime, the government has increased the value from 250 to $325,000. And so mostly here you see the Rigo, it's like a low-lying area and demolished lot. So we visited like in last year in 2022, while we were interviewing municipal officers, we visited some of the municipalities, and we see that the demolished lots they are like still vacant lots. So the government has done nothing to deal with this. And during our interview, we asked the mayors, like, what are you planning to do with the lots? And they said like they are still figuring out. They don't know like what should they do with these lots, because it's also an extra burden on the municipal government to take care of these lots. So we are like in the middle of our interviews. So we are interviewing the relocated households, the municipal officials, and we are also planning to interview some of the provincial governments, those who came up with this policy. And then we will interview those who are still in the flood prone area in 0 to 20 year flood plan. So the research will be both qualitative and quantitative, and we are planning to do like a community resilience assessment tool to check the resilience level of the households, also the relocated and those still living in that area, in the flood prone area. So unfortunately, I cannot present the findings because we are still in the middle of interviewing the households. So maybe next time. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for listening.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm really excited to be here with you all today, both this afternoon and at this conference. My name is Annika Tomson. I am a NOAA Digital Coast Fellow with the Coastal States Organization and the Association of State Floodplain Managers. And I'm here today to present some initial findings from a project that I've been working on for the past 8 months on sending communities and acquired properties. So rightfully, there is and has been a great deal of attention paid to community relocation in the managed retreat climate displacement space, but that is not necessarily a realistic future for many coastal communities in the United States. In many of these communities, two truths will exist at the same time. People are going to leave, but people are also going to stay. And of course, there are nuances within that, people leaving in stages. So, you initially made the decision to stay, but then eventually make the decision to leave. And also people relocating within the broader community. But at the intersection of those two truths, you can find this question: how can the land that people leave behind support those who stay? So that is where my project work and my research exists, trying to answer this question. So this fellowship project is specifically looking at the public management of previously private coastal property that has become public due to challenges with inundation and/or erosion as a facet of climate-driven displacement in the United States. It does cover buyouts, but it also covers other methods of acquisition like donation, eminent domain, abandonment, etc. And the target audience for this project and its deliverables are coastal municipalities. But in particular for the case studies and the interviews, I am looking at other communities and hazards, as there are lessons to be learned from analogous situations like riverine flooding. And from the perspective of this project, tribal governments, states, federal agencies, and nonprofits are partners doing related and parallel work, but not necessarily the target audience. So the project includes a literature review, interviews, the development of case studies, which will all lead into the development of technical guidance over the next year. So I'm going to present some key findings from the literature review, but mainly spend some time with some initial findings from the interviews. So I conducted a literature review on technical resources available to to communities dealing with this challenge of previously private coastal property. And some key findings are that buyouts make up a significant portion of the previously private coastal property specific literature. And there are far fewer resources available for when the parcel is transferred piecemeal or when the property is abandoned and sits vacant for a period of time. And there's a lack of technical guidance for site-specific challenges. So for example, either capping or removing a septic tank that's in land that is still experiencing a hazard, like it's on a beach and it's eroded and it's kind of in the ocean. What do you do there? There's not a resource that answers that question. And then as well, uses specific to previously private coastal property, like leasebacks, also have few technical resources. So those are some key findings from the literature review, but I now want to spend the rest of our time talking about some initial findings from the interviews and the experiences of the interviewee communities. And naturally, I want to talk about Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So 15 years ago, in 2008, a number of factors caused the Cedar River to crest to its highest level in the city's history. 14% of the city was inundated, around 7,000 parcels were impacted, and over 5,000 homes. Fortunately, no one was killed, but there was a significant amount of property and infrastructure damage and emotional damage to the community. And in the 15 years since the flood, the city has acquired over 1,300 homes to implement a long-term flood control project along the Cedar River to protect residents and infrastructure, and as well as to re-encourage investment in the city. And as it stands, they have funding for about 60 to 70% of the flood control work, and about 30% of the work is complete. And while the city's work will carry on well into the future, there are many lessons to be learned from their long-term planning and recovery process, and I'll be returning to them throughout the findings portion, as well as some other people I've spoken to. So the first thing that I want to share with you is that short-term solutions can preclude long-term resilience. So in Cedar Rapids, technically the first source of funding available for acquisitions was FEMA funding, as HUD funding requires action by Congress. However, the city did not immediately pursue FEMA funding for acquisitions, as the deed restrictions could have conflicted with their long-term flood control work. Instead, they waited for HUD funding and only used FEMA funding in specific cases where it would not conflict with flood control work. The photo on the slide is not from a bought out area, but it was the first project completed in the city. And this is a levee on the western shore of the river, and it doubles as a levee and an amphitheater. And once the flood control work is completed, this levee will connect with other levees on the western shore of the river that are located on HUD-funded buyout properties. Conversely, in Tillamook, Oregon, the city acquired flooded properties in their commercial corridor in the late 2000s, and the city then gave permanent easements for parking to some of these bought out parcels to neighboring businesses. And this decision and the legal complexities that it's created precludes current staff from doing really anything else with the parcels, as there isn't the capacity to unpick the legal knot that was created well over a decade ago. The second thing I've found so far is that there's a real importance to being nimble on funding sources. Cedar Rapids is using a variety of funding sources to complete their flood control work. The Corps is funding and doing a lot of the work on the eastern side of the river, but the Corps' cost-benefit analysis or equation does not really support much of the work the city wants to do on the western side of the river. So the city has been piecing together other funding sources to complete their flooding control work on the western shore. So they successfully lobbied for state funding, but that will not be fully collected until 2034. So they've also additionally raised their levy tax, and they also allocated some of their COVID relief dollars for flood control work. And the city will need to continue to be creative and patient as that funding source collects and they pull in other sources of funding to complete their flood control work. I also spoke with Lake County, Illinois, and the county stormwater commission there has a designated buyout staffer, and she partners with around 50 different jurisdictions in their county to facilitate and implement buyouts. They largely use FEMA funding, but she has also utilized HUD funding as well as state and local funding when it was available and when it better suited the desired use of the parcel. And the photo on this slide shows a former school site in the county, and the property created some complex challenges that required innovation on the commission and their partners' part to get it fully acquired, funded, and remediated. In particular, there was a bus bay with some underground diesel storage tanks that had slightly leaked into the surrounding soil. And they had to figure out how to deal with that and fund that work. That being said, staff adaptability and capacity is not necessarily enough capacity to utilize a variety of different funding sources is not necessarily enough to get acquisition work done. In Monroe County, Florida, which includes the Florida Keys, they've only been able to use HUD funding for acquisitions, but it's not really for lack of trying. With the funding, the acquisition funding that they did have, they were competing with the private market to acquire homes post Hurricane Irma. While they do have the knowledge and capacity to utilize FEMA funding for more preventative buyouts, they have not been able to get property owner buy-in to complete those acquisitions. And there was also an opportunity for the Corps to do some work in the county, but the Corps required the use of eminent domain as the acquisition mechanism, and the county commission would not support that project with the use of eminent domain. So that opportunity was not used. So the third finding I'm going to share with you today, it's actually one of the first things that became clear to me while I was doing this work. And that is really the importance of a vision of the future, and critically, a community-driven vision of that future. Somebody's answer to the question, what can we live like when this land is no longer permanently habitable? So in Cedar Rapids, they held their first community engagement meeting around 4 days after the floodwaters peaked. And these meetings were really a one-stop shop for all things flood recovery. How do you clean up a flooded home? How do you contact the NFIP about your flood insurance? And what do you want the city to do about future flood risk and future floods? And these meetings continued through the initial recovery phase, and about 5 months after the flood event, the city council adopted their initial flood control plan. And this plan included levees and other flood control measures. And critically, it necessitated the acquisition of well over 1,000 homes, largely on the west side of the river. And in particular, one neighborhood would be significantly impacted by these acquisitions, as space was needed for the river to breathe. So Time Check is a blue-collar working class neighborhood, and many residents have strong ties to the neighborhood. And following the passage of the flood control plan, the city went through a 5-month visioning process, and residents from around the city contributed and drove the citywide vision of the future, but particular attention was paid to Time Check since they were a significant portion of the neighborhood was going to be acquired. So this map that you see here is one of the outcomes of that visioning process and also ongoing planning work in Time Check. So this shows the plans for the acquired area of the neighborhood. It includes the necessary flood control structures, like pump houses, but it also has community gardens, variety of sporting fields and courts, trails that connect to other green spaces that have been created by flood control work in the city, and multiple launch points on the river as well. I will note that this is the area of the city that the Corps' cost-benefit equation does not support federal funding and work. So the city has acquired funding, that's state funding, but it again it will take until 2034 to fully collect, and thus it will be in the mid-2030s when this work is completed, and therefore the whole city protected from flooding. And as I said, it's been 15 years since this flood event, and it'll be at least 12 before work is completed. And it would be very easy, to lose momentum, both as residents and staff, as work drags on and goes through slow periods. But the person I spoke with, she really credited this initial creation of a vision of their future community as key to maintaining momentum and getting through those difficult periods. City staff and their partners have a clear picture of what the people they work on behalf of want that survives, staff turnover. It's there, they can refer to it, and that is a through line throughout their work and the individual projects that they're doing. And then conversely, residents also understand what their city government and community is working towards when the city government does sometimes frustrating things like closing a road or raising your levy tax. That's something that they can return to as what they are all working towards. So finally, the person I spoke with at Cedar Rapids, she had been there, she had just been working for the city for a few years before the flood, all the way during the flood and all the way through the recovery, and she's still working there now. So she has seen this process from beginning to now. And she really described their visioning process as a grieving process. It was a space for their community members to process the trauma of the disaster they had experienced, but also to grieve their neighborhood as they knew it. And ultimately, she thought that the process and its outcomes were better off for having the hard parts of the conversation instead of skirting by and ignoring them. And as my project continues to unfold, I'm really interested in this, in particular, as it applies to planning for coastal climate impacts and as managed a retreat as you can get. There are reasons why this conversation is difficult to have, and I'm curious to see how a community's planning for sea level rise and climate impacts can incorporate the difficult parts of the conversation to build a more meaningful and productive process and outcome. So Monroe County, Florida, who I mentioned earlier, is having very preliminary conversations about the reshaping of their community through climate change. And I am planning to follow along in the coming months to see how those planning decisions take shape and what parts of the conversation they decide to have. So I'd like to close this out with another question. Is there a municipality that you think I should be speaking with? I'm still very much conducting interviews and this project is ongoing, and I would appreciate really any and all recommendations. My email is up there. You can also find me after for in person, and I'm also on the conference app. Thank you all so much for your time this afternoon. And I'm looking forward to our discussion and questions following.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about some things we're doing in Louisiana. My name is Pat Forbes. I'm the executive director of the Louisiana Office of Community Development. And just to be clear, our primary job, our practically only job, is distributing, administering community development block grants after disasters. So don't want the name to be confusing. Okay, so these are some of the different funding sources that we are working with now. For years and years, disaster after disaster, we would just get DR funds. And in the early years after Katrina, say, we were prohibited even from doing anything that was considered mitigation, that was not addressing the immediate impacts of the disaster for which the funds were appropriated. As HUD and Congress have progressed in their funding for disaster recovery, they have taken a different, evolved to a different place such that they started allowing mitigation for certain things. Now they even include money that must be used for mitigation. The most interesting piece of funding we have here came from the HUD's disaster recovery resilience competition, which was really after Hurricane Sandy, but for us, it was Hurricane Isaac. And they had a competition and we won money to do a couple of things. One was called LA Safe, which you see here. It's essentially looking at risk on the coast going in, the different levels of risk and different adaptation approaches for each of those levels of risk, all the way up to low risk, where we've got to prepare for the communities that are leaving the coast. Île-de-Jean-Charles resettlement, you may have heard about before. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail here shortly. Louisiana Watershed Initiative is a funding source that we have. That's not really the funding source. The funding source is CDBG mitigation funds, which is a fairly new thing. And what we did, since almost our entire state was inundated in this one flood, we stood up a statewide program to change our approach to flood risk to look at watersheds as opposed to jurisdictional boundaries. And then, of course, Restore Louisiana is a simple homeowner rebuilding program post-disaster, but it factors into some of the work that we're doing. I apologize to you if you have been at this conference and will be here for the next 2 days. You will have heard most of the things that I will say today. Hopefully I'll have some information from a sort of practitioner's perspective that will be helpful. So I may go quickly through some of these things because you all know them maybe probably better than I do. First, when we're looking at buyouts or relocations, first and foremost is getting people out of harm's way. Equity, how do we make sure we're not unduly enriching anyone, but making sure that the disinvestments and lower investments of the past aren't replicated or even compounded when we move forward. This is a new one that really came to us in Île-de-Jean-Charles, which is we have this predominantly Native American community that has lived on this island for 150 years. So all their ancestors grew up there and their ancestors. And so one of our challenges was not just getting people to a safe place to live, but how do we do that in such a way that maybe that community cohesion and that culture somehow could be maintained and enhanced. We know it can't be the same. It's not the same place. It's not their place, but nonetheless, how do we try to maximize that at least? Natural function of floodplains. More and more, it's clear that if we do buyouts and we don't do them in such a way that we are restoring floodplains and reducing risk for everybody else, that we're really missing the boat. And then corollary to that is reducing, oh yeah, it worked. Reducing flood insurance policies. So next I'll go to Île-de-Jean-Charles. As I said, mostly Native American, low to moderate income community. Louisiana's coastal land loss is highest in the country, if not the world. We've got a bunch of things going on there. Oil and gas exploration cause saltwater intrusion. We've got subsidence, which is a natural thing in a coastal plain, except it used to get filled back with dirt from the Mississippi River, and we cut that off with levees. And then we've got sea level rise, so it's all sort of compounding there for us. And Île-de-Jean-Charles land mass has reduced by 98% since, say, the 1940s. Their population has gone down from 400 to about 100 in 2012. People, couldn't get to their jobs and schools and churches from the island. And so consequently, for the most part, the people who had the financial wherewithal migrated on their own. As I said, National Disaster Resilience Competition was the source of funding for that. We had $48 million. We're going to move 40 families, maybe. I'm sure you can all do the math pretty quickly. It's a stunning number per family. There are lots of extenuating circumstances there. One, it's the first time we've tried to do this, or that we know of that anybody's tried to do this. Two, some of the challenges associated with moving this Native American family and trying to replicate their culture in the new spot, that in a place 40 miles away, really daunting, and it takes a lot of land to do that. But we're also we have also built a community that can grow back to the size of the original island population. So we're not just moving these folks, we're creating the infrastructure for the community to regather. This was absolutely critical. We got nearly 100% participation in this buyout, in this relocation, but we wouldn't have gotten 30% if we hadn't been able to guarantee access back to the island. That's their ancestral home. It's where all their ancestors are buried. They decided they did not want to try to move the cemetery, but at the same time, they wanted to continue to have access to the island, to their land, and in a remarkable stroke of adaptability, HUD allowed us to leave the properties in the names of the folks who live there on the island, not just the property, but the structures. We've got restrictions. You can't rebuild it back if it gets whacked. You can't make money with it, rent it out or sell it or anything like that, but you can keep it and your fishing camp, if you will, until it's not there anymore, until you can't get to it anymore, which is a remarkable departure from anything we've ever done before in terms of being able to leave somebody with a second home, if you will. Now, these were not like really nice homes, nonetheless, it was quite remarkable. And resident-driven planning and design. The picture you're looking at here is one of the many meetings we had with residents to talk through, where do you want to live? What are your priorities for what that community would reflect about where you live now? What would be the things that would be improved from where you live now? I have heard so many things, I have to say, just in the short time we've been here that have added to what I wanted to talk about today, because there is just so much to gather. But this resident-driven planning and design is really, I've heard it 3 or 4 times, and it's so critical. The folks decided where their new property was going to be. We looked at all the options and took them out there to the different places so they could look and then go back and vote about where did they want their new community to be, which is critical, absolutely critical for people to have a say in where they're going. So the outcomes, we've got 37 of 40 families that lived on the island at the time who are eligible are moving to the new Isle. That's the name that the residents chose for the new development. 34 of them live in their homes now. 3 more homes are being constructed, will be done, and they'll be moved in before the end of the year. What you're looking at in this picture is probably 1/3 of the total land. We bought 500 acres for this, and I will go through, if you look at the 4th bullet down, economic and commercial development sites for revenue generation, you can see that swamp wetland on the right. In front of that is highway front property that's very valuable commercial property. We bought that too. And so the idea here is that we will now use those commercial properties to generate revenues to help subsidize the folks who are living in at the new Isle. They almost by definition were poor. That's why they still lived on the island. They could not afford to get off. They didn't pay property taxes. We have something called the homestead exemption in Louisiana, so that if your home value is below $75,000, you don't pay any taxes. They didn't have insurance. And so none of those were monthly expenses that they now have, or annual expenses that they now have. So somehow we got to make this sustainable for them. So we've got to generate revenues to be able to subsidize that. So we'll use the commercial properties up front for that. Then to the left of this, across that bayou, is an entire other tract of land just like this one for the expansion, for people as the tribe starts to convene, there will be places for people to be able to come build houses. We also, in another remarkable move from HUD, they let us give free lots to families who had left before our eligibility period. So even though we can't build them a house, we at least can give them a free lot. And we're working with a Chodo and some home funds so that we can make that affordable for just about anybody who wants to move there. Buyouts. So there are a bunch of different, I'm sorry, that Ile-de-Jean-Charles was the first thing we ever did like this, and it's dramatically different from anything I'm about to talk about. Everything now is a lot more like what you're probably used to in terms of buyouts and relocations, et cetera. Restore Solution 4. Essentially, we have a program where we go build people's houses back after a storm. And if you're in a floodway, we can't do that. We're prohibited from spending our funds in a floodway. What we are allowed to do, however, is get you out of that floodway. So we can offer to to buy people out. And we even have options to let them keep their land. Oftentimes the challenge you run into is that people who live in dangerous places are there because it's like a family land from ages and ages. We figured out a way to just buy out the house, promise that there's no more construction on there. You get to keep your family land and then go get a house somewhere else. That was a critical first step. Pecan Acres is a neighborhood predominantly African-American, predominantly, if not exclusively, low to moderate income, that was built in the 70s, has flooded 17 times since then, never should have been built there, just like most of the communities that most of us are working with when we're talking about buyouts. Somebody went and made a bunch of money by making something affordable. The reason it was affordable was it never should have been there. It was in cheap land that floods. So Pecan Acres was different in that there was no available housing in the community, in the parish where this little neighborhood was. And so we couldn't even give them money to go buy another house because there weren't other houses to buy. So we built another neighborhood about 2 miles away, much safer, 9 feet higher, and got about half the folks to take us up on moving there because they wanted to stay with their community. The other half took buyouts. I'm going to talk through these buyouts in a second and how that works because it's an important point to catch. And now we're doing community buyouts. I talked about the mitigation funds earlier. We are taking money from that mitigation fund, and we went around the state, worked with local governments to identify entire communities that flood regularly so that we could not just go do what we often call checkerboard buyouts, but to buy out whole neighborhoods so that the floodplain could be reconnected to that. And you all have already seen examples of that this afternoon. But critical piece of this is making sure that it's worthwhile for everybody to go. So the buyout awards are a combination of the fair market value. And mind you, these are not all storm damaged, right? They didn't, since it's a mitigation program, we don't necessarily have to just work with people whose homes were damaged. We can go to the whole neighborhood. So it's a combination of fair market value, pre-storm, if you will, and housing incentive. And the housing incentive is another remarkable thing that HUD let us do with our funds, and I'll explain it in more detail in a minute. Essentially, though, we use FEMA data about where damages are. We work with locals and we find the communities that are repetitively flooded. These are some of the communities, and you can see the only reason I left this slide in is you can see that we prioritize, and clearly, obviously, the higher the priority, the more flood prone it is. And so if we've only got a certain amount of money, we tell them up front, we've got your neighborhood segmented by priorities, and we're going to buy y'all out in that order. And so far, it has worked quite well to get people out of the way. Housing incentive. I'm just going to hit this because my time is up. So the houses in Pecan Acres were worth probably $40,000. Just the insurance is $8,000 a year. They flood all the time. Nobody wants to live there. So we could buy them out at $40,000, but we knew we did a survey of average cost to buy a home in that community on safe ground. Came up with a cost per square foot, multiply that times the number of square feet in their house, and that's their total offer. So if that number comes out to 150,000 and their house was only worth 40,000, we add it from CDBG $110,000 housing incentive so that they then can go either use that money to buy a house in a safer place or take us up on moving to the new community in the house there. Really interesting way. I heard about the 110% plus up earlier. That's interesting too. The one thing about this is from an equity perspective, if your house was $1 million or $100,000, we're only going to pay the average cost per square foot for that community. So it tends to help lower income households that had been disadvantaged previously more so than folks who could afford to get out on their own, if that makes sense. This is the calculation, and this presentation will be available, and actually our policies and procedures are all available online, so you could look up in very great detail what that looks like. Yeah, well, thank you very much.
My name is Liz. I work for the city of New York with our housing recovery program post Hurricane Sandy. So I'm asking this from this perspective of practitioners. So there's an awful lot I don't know about buyouts, so it's fascinating to hear about what you've been doing in other communities. Some of the stuff like means testing, like that is a requirement for our program. So I'm interested to know that other places aren't doing that. Certainly with the HUD money, I thought that was a requirement, but that just could be how we wrote our action plan. I think one of the things that was interesting in just an overview of some of your research, and maybe this is because you just didn't speak about this, is what the government's objective was in implementing a buyout program at all. So I think what was interesting about the Quebec program, again, this is just based on what you said, like if you're just giving people cash and like with not actually doing an appraised value of the home, I don't even know what the point of, and then you're letting people come back in and develop the property. It doesn't sound like what they were trying to accomplish was actually taking people out of harm's way, but rather just demolishing homes that probably aren't flood worthy. So I think what maybe, and again, just showing my ignorance of your programs, but I think that's something when we look at buyout programs is really to appreciate what the government is trying to accomplish. Because I think I think it can go in different ways, right? It can be actually a climate mitigation strategy amongst many, but it can also just be like, if in its truest sense, it really should be taking people out of harm's way as a harm reduction strategy. I think some of you have used that phrase, but I don't get the impression that that's necessarily the same in every jurisdiction you were reporting on.
So the lots that we buy, I don't know if this works. The lots that we buy are in green space in perpetuity. So that's part of the benefit.
Yeah, we did here a combination of acquisition for redevelopment, as well as for affordable housing redevelopment, as well as taking it off hands in perpetuity. But I wasn't sure if that was the Quebec model as well.
You know, I'll just add that HUD, the majority of buyout funding is coming through FEMA, which doesn't means test, but HUD does. And so I sort of didn't get into it, but one thought is, should we be moving more of that? Should we be funneling the majority of buyouts through HUD?
So I think like, unlike US, so Canadian, they don't have like any policies related to buyouts. So right now maybe the governments are in a development phase. So they are still looking for any policies. So it was like when there was flooding in 17, they immediately applied this. Like there was a kind of, so when I was interviewing one researcher, he was also working on this. So he told me that from the government perspective, it was only like issuing a check to the households, and then you are free to go wherever you want, but you cannot build, and then they will just demolish your lot.
We also required, when we buy somebody out, say in that floodway program, they have to show us their new address, and it has to be in a safer place. It has to be in the 500 or non-flood, non-special flood hazard.
Hi. It's Anna from NRDC. Thanks for your presentations. I have two questions, but they're short, I promise. First, for Kay, the second presentation, I'm curious in your data analysis, how representative those 2,000 property records that you ended up with are of the overall 40 to 50,000 property data set. I'm pretty familiar with that data set and know the challenges of working with it. And so I'm curious how good of a sample you think that is compared to the full data set.
You want to ask the second question too?
Oh, but my second question is for Stephanie.
We did a robustness check looking at American Community Survey variables to try and compare the two populations. The sample is a little more diverse, but pretty consistent once we have cleaned. We cut the top 1% and bottom 1% of households, and yeah, I can show you more of the robustness checks, but slightly more diverse, but surprisingly similar.
Thanks. That's super interesting, a really interesting analysis. And my other question is about your means testing proposal, Stephanie. I'm curious, do you have a specific proposal for how these programs should be means testing? I think, you know, many of us or all of us understand, you know, the complexity of trying to create benefit for those who otherwise would not have the ability to move, but at the same time, not targeting communities who don't want to move. And so I'm curious if you have ideas about developing a means testing methodology that would keep those considerations in mind. Thanks.
You know, I thought about this somewhat when I wrote my paper. I sort of punted and I said, look, the federal government has lots of, established formulas for means testing, and we can choose one of them. But one thought that I had that I didn't, it didn't get into a lot of detail in that particular paper is that it might make sense to implement that more at the state level, so that you could respond to, just really specific characteristics and differences. But, as far as like kind of down to brass tacks, what would the income cutoff be? I'm going to have to defer to the economists.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Hersher. I'm from NPR. Annika, I had a question for you. You mentioned in Cedar Rapids that they decided not to go for FEMA funding because the requirements of that money were not in line with their bigger goals. And I wonder if you could say more about that and what it was about CDBG money that was more accessible.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of like a technicality that you can get FEMA, in theory, get FEMA funding first. And the HUD funding requires more action. And Cedar Rapids knew relatively quickly in their recovery process that they wanted to implement structural flood controls like levees and flood walls and floodgates. And the FEMA deed restrictions would have really prevented any of those structural flood control mechanisms from being built. So there's a figure somewhere online that shows the FEMA funding was used, and it's just hyper concentrated very close to the river. And it's in between in time check where the levee will be and where the river is. So they did end up using FEMA funding, but only after they were certain that the structures that they did want to build would not be impacted by it. And so they used largely HUD funding everywhere else where they did acquisitions.
I would add real quickly, you can also use CDBG money as the match for FEMA HMGP if that becomes an issue, because in the HMGP program, what you always end up with is poor people can't pay their match. And so they don't get bought out or elevated. So you can keep that in mind as well.
My question was for Kay around the findings that people of color were worse off than white people when they were relocated. Why? Does that have to do with appraisal bias? I mainly work in property taxes, and I know that's a huge thing. Is it sort of that their numbers are coming in artificially low, or what? And then I guess the follow up on that is if this is the case, there's been debates, throughout this conference about whether you recommend to lower income people to take buyouts, or if you go for, higher income people, to the extent that race and income are correlated, like, does this finding inform that? And, what's more equitable?
Yeah, why is a great question. I think there's multiple theories there. I mean, we know from other research in the social sciences that particularly Black households, if buyers are aware of the race of the buyer, we see a significant decrease in the offers made. So implicit bias, direct bias, that there have been presentations earlier today that sort of talked about some particular theories, but as far as a solution, race-conscious policies are really controversial in the US. I think that training and working and awareness with the people who actually implement and make these decisions could help. And yeah, some of the other solutions talked about today, Louisiana has some interesting programs that I think if we moved to a different approach like that, that maybe that would help with this discrimination that we clearly see.
Hi, I'm Lucy Perkins. I'm with the New Hampshire Coastal Program. And first, just want to say thanks to all of you for your presentations. My question's for Pat. You shared the image of the prioritizations of the neighborhood, and I'm curious if you could explain sort of the methodology behind that, and then also how you communicated that prioritization to residents that live there and how that was received.
I'm sorry, can you say?
I definitely can, yes. My question has a couple of parts to it. First, it was, can you explain how you established the prioritization of the different parts of the neighborhood that you showed in one of your slides, and then how you communicated that to folks that lived there and how that was received by the community?
I think the question is about how do we do the calculation?
There's a slide that you had sort of different maps of a few neighborhoods with priority. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we looked at the base flood elevations, right? And just drew a map on those contours and saw what was going to flood first. And that's sort of where we drew the priority lines. Some of them looked awfully rectangular for what I just said to be true, but the neighborhoods were laid out that way. Whenever they graded them and everything, they just made their way up from the back and made it all flat. So despite the fact that those things didn't really look like it, they actually reflect the contours or the flood maps.
Hi, my question is also for Pat, but first, thank you all for your great presentations. Pat, if you could say a few more words about how you navigated that process with HUD and CDBG-DR funds to allow residents to keep their land and also their properties after relocating. So having like 2 different properties. Thank you.
I hope there aren't any HUD folks who be mad at us. We just went back repeatedly to them and made it clear that we were not going to have a successful program if we were not able to somehow leave possession with those folks. And so they came up with this innovative response, which is what we now call housing incentive. And that's the same thing that we use to be able to help people get out of the floodway, is housing incentive. And so that's something you can look up in the regulations. leaving them with the second home. I don't know if they'll ever do that again. This was an NDRC, and so they were sort of, you know, out at the edge of the envelope to try to make it work. But I wouldn't not try.